Hi everyone! In this video, I'm going to go over several methods of contraception that do not contain any hormones. We'll start by looking at the natural methods that are currently in use, and then we'll go over many other options that are available without a prescription on the shelves of any pharmacy near you. Finally, I'll go over some of the advantages and disadvantages of each method. Natural methods. The first natural method we'll look at is called the basal body temperature method. Basal body temperature means the lowest temperature of the day in a healthy person while they're awake so that they can measure it. So the woman would need to take her temperature as soon as she wakes up in the morning. If she sleeps in, for example, the reading won't be as accurate. The basal body temperature is at a stable low during your period through till about 4 to 5 days later. Around the time of ovulation, a slight drop in temperature, about half a degree Celsius, can occur but doesn't in everyone. What you need to remember is that after ovulation, the basal body temperature rises slightly and stays at this elevated plateau until about 2 to 4 days before your next period. If you get pregnant, your temperature will stay at that slightly elevated level, and if you're not pregnant, it drops again during your period and goes back to the beginning of the cycle. Now let's look at the symptothermal method, which is basically the basal body temperature method that we just went over, plus cervical mucus monitoring, which we'll go over in a minute, and can also be a method of contraception in itself, as well as symptom monitoring. So cervical mucus monitoring involves assessing the amount and consistency of cervical mucus coming out of the vagina every day of the menstrual cycle. A woman knows she is fertile in the days leading up to ovulation and including ovulation, when she has the highest mucus production that is increasingly wet, slippery, and clear. Right before and after her period, when she is no longer fertile, she'll notice little to no mucus. Symptom monitoring includes both physical and psychological symptoms, such as cramping and increased libido prior to ovulation, or cramping and irritability prior to menstruation. It's important that women keep track of all this data on a calendar or notebook in order to get to know their cycle and for the method to be effective. Other natural fertility awareness methods include the LH home test kits, which aren't necessarily a method of themselves but can be used with other methods. So they're urine strips that measure the surge of LH hormone in your urine right before ovulation occurs. This helps confirm when in your cycle you ovulate, and it can also be very helpful for when you're actually trying to get pregnant in the future. The calendar method is the most basic method and should not be used on its own either. It involves keeping track of how long your cycle is from the first day of your period until your next period for at least 6 months, because not everyone has a cycle that's exactly 28 days every month. So you need to know how long the longest cycle is and the shortest in order to do the calculations that are necessary to estimate accurately when ovulation occurs and which days you're fertile. So both of these methods are usually combined with the basal body temperature or symptothermal or just cervical mucus monitoring methods, but shouldn't be used alone. Now let's go over the advantages and disadvantages of all the natural methods that we've looked at this far. The advantages are that natural methods are the safest ones in terms of the health of the woman. There are no hormones taken, no side effects, and it's a natural form of contraception. The costs are minimal. You become way more aware of your body and how it works. It can foster stronger communication between the couple because both need to know where they're at in the cycle and they both need to be on board for this method of contraception. If remaining abstinent during periods of fertility, this could push couples to explore alternate sexual activities than intercourse. When you use natural contraceptive methods in combination, for example, basal body temperature with LH testing in the calendar, let's say, they can be highly effective if both partners are fully committed, if your cycle is regular with consistent patterns, and if you use the methods properly. Disadvantages. So the SOGC says that natural methods are statistically the least effective. This is likely because you absolutely need both people to be fully on board. Periods of abstinence can be very difficult for couples, and also if you're changing partners or having unplanned sex, it can be difficult to avoid that window of fertility. It also requires time and practice to use the methods properly, and discipline and commitment in recording the data each day and following the rules. So also remember that natural methods do not provide any protection against sexually transmitted infections. I just want to add that if it does not go against your beliefs or your desires, there's no reason to not use another form of contraceptive during the period of fertility if you do not want to use abstinence. This will help the natural methods to be more effective if you want to have intercourse during those times, but ultimately, abstinence is the surest way to prevent pregnancy. Before moving on to the over-the-counter contraceptives, there are two final natural methods that are very different than the ones we just looked at. First, there is lactation amenorrhea method, which can only be used by a mother who is exclusively breastfeeding her baby, and the effectiveness is highest from baby's birth to 6 months of age. Because breastfeeding stimulates prolactin production, which inhibits estrogen production, it actually ends up suppressing ovulation. That's how it works as a contraceptive. It's most effective if mom breastfeeds every 4 hours during the day, every 6 hours through the night, and doesn't use supplementation because this leads to the baby taking less from the breast. Under these conditions, the failure rate is only 2% for women who exclusively breastfeed from 0 to 6 months. Some disadvantages are that it's only a temporary form of contraception because after 6 months, fertility can return at any time. Not being able to use supplementation can also be difficult for some mothers. And like the other natural methods, lactation amenorrhea does not protect against sexually transmitted infections. Other advantages are that it's free, convenient for the most part, safe, and it's also natural. Finally, there is the withdrawal method that is also considered a natural method. This is where the man withdraws his penis from the woman's vagina and external genitalia before ejaculating. This is a risky method, however, because there is some fluid containing sperm that can be released prior to ejaculation, so the woman could still get pregnant. It's also not easy in that it takes a lot of self-control on the part of the man. It does not protect against sexually transmitted infections because there's no barrier involved, and it's not very effective as a method of contraception. The advantages are that it's convenient since you don't have to think ahead and buy something. It's free and there's no hormones or side effects involved. Alright, so now we can get into the over-the-counter contraceptive options that are also hormone-free. Let's start with the one you're most familiar with, the condom. There are male condoms and female condoms, which we will briefly contrast and compare. Male condoms are latex and have latex-free options. They're very cheap. They're widely available and they're safe. And the male as well as female condoms are only one-time use. Male condoms protect against sexually transmitted infections, but not all of them. Genital herpes, for example, could still be passed from one partner to the other. They're very effective. 2% of women get pregnant in the first year of use if used perfectly, and 18% if used typically. And the disadvantages are that male condoms need to be applied when the penis is erect, which can interfere with the maintenance of an erection. This also can interfere with the spontaneity of sex. Condoms can also reduce sensitivity for the male, and they may slip or break, so they need to be handled properly. Female condoms, on the other hand, are actually more expensive and less effective than male condoms. 5% of women will get pregnant with perfect use, and 21% with typical use. Female condoms are apparently noisier during sex, and they can slip or break just like the male condom, so they need to be handled properly. Some women also have trouble putting the condom in, and the rings at both ends can potentially cause discomfort during intercourse. Advantages are that they do protect against sexually transmitted infections. You can place them up to 8 hours in advance, which helps with spontaneity, and the male partner sometimes may prefer it to the male condom. The contraceptive sponge. So this is essentially a foam sponge that contains spermicides within it. It acts as a physical barrier, blocking the cervix in that dip in the dome that you see there, and it traps and destroys sperm cells by breaking through the sperm cell membrane. Effectiveness with typical use is higher with women who have never given birth. They are called nulliparous women. Failure rates are as high as 24% with women who have given birth. The timeline in which the sponge should be inserted and withdrawn is as follows. You can put it in a maximum of 24 hours before intercourse, and there's a reason for this. It's because once you have intercourse, you need to keep the sponge in place for at least 6 hours afterwards in order for it to be effective. So if you add 24 hours plus 6 hours, you get 30 hours, which is the big maximum amount of time that you want to keep a sponge on the cervix. Otherwise, your risk of getting toxic shock syndrome goes up, and I'll explain in a bit what that is. Other advantages are that there are no hormones, no prescription needed, hence over the counter, and you can have sex several times within the first 24 hours without needing to take it out and replace it. Other disadvantages, other than the time constraint and the lack of effectiveness, are that sponges don't protect against sexually transmitted infections. Some women have trouble putting it in, and it could cause irritation and abrasions to the vagina or cervix. There are 2 other physical barrier methods similar to the contraceptive sponge that I'll just briefly go over. These 2 are not available over the counter though, because they need to be fitted by your doctor. If they're too small or too big to fit properly over the cervix, they won't be effective. So we have the diaphragm and the cervical cap. The diaphragm is a latex or silicone-shaped dome that is inserted over the opening of the cervix. It doesn't contain spermicides already, but you can put some, and therefore it should be inserted a maximum of 2 hours prior to intercourse and kept in 6 hours after intercourse in order to be effective. It should not remain in place longer than 24 hours total because of the risk of toxic shock syndrome. It doesn't need to be replaced very often, and it does not protect against sexually transmitted infections. The cervical cap is also a silicone-shaped dome, but it's more shaped like a cap, and it stays on the cervix by suction. It can also hold spermicides, and therefore should be inserted a maximum 2 hours prior to intercourse and stay in 6 hours later. The maximum time that it should be inserted total is 48 hours because of the risk of toxic shock syndrome, and it also does not protect against sexually transmitted infections. Now you may be wondering, wait, you just mentioned spermicides. What are those? So spermicides are a chemical compound called nonoxynol 9 or N9 that you can get at your local pharmacy in several forms. So you can get it in the form of a cream, gel, foam, film, or suppository. You need to follow the instructions to know when to put them in depending on what form you bought it in. Spermicides work by destroying the membrane of the sperm cells. It needs to be reapplied before every act of sexual intercourse in order for it to remain effective. Spermicides by themselves are one of the least effective methods of contraception. Failure rates are 28% with typical use and 18% with perfect use. So spermicides really should be used in combination with other contraceptive methods, such as the ones we just went over, the diaphragm, the cap, and the sponge. Now let's go over toxic shock syndrome. This is what I would like to end this presentation with, and it is important. Toxic shock syndrome is a life-threatening bacterial infection, but it's also very rare. It is often caused by a bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus, which is actually a very common bacteria that can be naturally found on the surface of our skin. Risk factors for getting the infection include anyone with open wound or skin abrasions, having surgery, and keeping tampons, menstrual cups, contraceptive sponges, caps, and diaphragms in for too long. The signs and symptoms include low blood pressure, so you would feel dizzy, faint, and weak, a rash that looks like a sunburn, particularly on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, vomiting or diarrhea. You can have a sudden high fever and headaches, or you can have muscle aches, If ever you experience some of these symptoms while using the cervical cap, diaphragm, or sponge, you should immediately contact your healthcare provider and seek medical attention. Thank you so much for watching this presentation, and I really hope that it was helpful for you to understand natural methods of contraception and also the ones that are available over the counter. I've included the references here at the bottom of the slide.